Oh, Michael.
That's a good field trip.
Was that right? All right, we all set? Ready to get going? I am very excited to be able to host this conversation tonight with Elizabeth Economy. I think as many of you know, this talk was sponsored by the American Grand Strategies Program and co-sponsored by my center, the Duke Center for International Development. So I have been a big fan of Elizabeth Economy for a long time. So last time with Catherine Tye, Peter accused me of going all fanboy. I'll try. I'll try. Feel free. So it's very hard to introduce someone with Elizabeth Economy's accomplishments, both in policy, in academia. But let me just try a little bit. But I want to save some time to get to the larger conversation. She is currently a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. From 2021 to 2023, she served as a senior foreign advisor for China in the Department of Commerce for the current administration, the Biden administration. And for 25 years, she was at the Council of Foreign Relations, where she served as the CV Starr Senior Fellow and Director for Asia Studies. She is an acclaimed author and expert on China's domestic and foreign policy. Her most recent book, which is excellent, which I want to delve into a little bit today, is The World According to China, which was published by Polity in 2022. And she's also the author of several other books, including The Third Revolution by Xi Jinping and the New Chinese State, which was shortlisted for the Lionel Gelber Prize. And her other books include By All Means Necessary, How China's Resource Quest is Changing the World, and The River Runs Black, The Environmental Change to China's Future. She has published everywhere in all the policy magazines and places that you read, including Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy. She is a go-to person when it comes to thinking about U.S.-China relations. She currently serves as on the board of managers at Swarthmore College and is a member of the Aspen Strategy Group. And she's been to the World Economic Forum, where she served at the Global Agenda Council for the United States from 2014 to 2016. So she is, I think this will be a really fun conversation because there are few people that have thought about U.S.-China policy at such a high level and in so many different dimensions as Elizabeth Economy. So with that, I thought, why don't we get started? And I thought we'd start a little bit by thinking about your book and sort of summarize kind of even an update on your book in some ways on China's current global ambitions and how you're thinking about that, both from your role at the Department of Commerce, but also your current role at the Hoover Institution.
Okay, thanks, Eddie. It's great to be here back at Duke. I was here a few years ago and spoke, but it's really nice to be back here, especially after having served in government. Gives me a little bit of a different perspective that I'm happy to share. So I think in terms of China's global ambitions, I don't know that serving at the Commerce Department has had much of an impact. It made me think differently about it. I think, I've been looking at China, as you noted, for decades at this point, and I feel as though I've been tracking, through those years, sort of how China's leaders talk about the country, how they talk about their ambitions, and now looking at their actions as well. So especially with the Xi Jinping period, which is really the period that the book focuses on, I think we've seen, China emerge obviously as a global power with pretty significant strategic ambitions. So I consider Xi Jinping to be a transformative leader. And there continues to be a bit of a debate in the China field, and I'm sure many of you are aware of this, over exactly what it is that Xi Jinping wants to accomplish. But I think you can read, over 2,000 pages of his speeches. And again, you can track what China is doing on the ground. And I think you can paint a pretty clear picture of what that looks like. And so I would just say I think his vision is transformative across 5 dimensions. And first and most important really is about reclaiming what Xi Jinping believes to be Chinese sovereign territory. And, in the first instance, that is, of course, what happened already with Hong Kong, but Taiwan and, a large part of the maritime domain in the South China Sea. But it also extends to, Diaoyu Senkaku Islands, which are administered by Japan. There's, areas in Bhutan that China claims that it's already trying to get at right now. There was the deadly border conflict with India during COVID. I think that was, I want to say it was 2020, late spring 2020. China has a number of border conflicts it would like to resolve in China's own favor. So I think in the first instance, it's about really redrawing the very map of China. I think moving out from there, if you kind of think of it in terms of concentric circles, moving out from there, I think China wants to become the dominant power in the Asia Pacific. People often ask, does China want to supplant the United States as a sole superpower? I don't think that actually is China's ambition as of now, but I do think it wants to supplant the United States as the dominant power in the Indo-Pacific. And I think you can see that, in terms of the military actions that it's taking. You can see it in terms of the economic arrangements that it's making. I also think, Xi Jinping talks often about Asia should be for Asians to govern, right? And he means China. He doesn't mean Japan or India, of course. And he calls for the dissolution of the U.S.-led alliance systems. He talks about them as anachronistic, the relic of the Cold War, and targeted against China. So I think that's the sort of second transformative element of his strategy. I think third is really having Chinese preferences, values, interests embedded in the policy choices of other countries. And I think there are a number of ways that China goes about this. I think most notably and most publicly really is China's Belt and Road Initiative, which of course began as a hard infrastructure initiative back in 2013, but since that time has morphed. You have the Digital Silk Road and the Health Silk Road and the Green Silk Road and the Polar Silk Road, all of these offshoots, which again, in the first instance, are about infrastructure. They were initially about exporting Chinese overcapacity, also connecting some of China's poor interior regions to external markets, and also filling a real need for global infrastructure that was not being met. But I think since that time, we see political components to the, for example, Digital Silk Road. So it's not just about, getting Huawei subsea cables or 5G. It's about 2-week cyber security training seminars on how to control the internet, right? How to manage dissent. China has a new military ambition. If you look back prior to 2011, 2012, historically, China has always said it would never have overseas military bases. That was very core to China's, security doctrine. But beginning in 2011, you started to see some Chinese scholars talk about why shouldn't China have bases overseas, right? China's a big power. Why shouldn't it? It should be able to protect its, economic interests overseas. And so the Belt and Road became then part of a broader strategy and a military strategy. So China has its first military logistics base in Djibouti in Africa, but more to come. Cambodia, there's talk about UAE, Equatorial Guinea. This is, a new element of China's sort of global ambition, really radically different from everything that has come before. Then fourth, I would say more recently, I think there's an ambition that Xi Jinping has articulated. He calls it dual circulation, which, builds on China's Made in China 2025 program, which was announced around 2014, 2015, and was a 10-year plan that basically said China wanted Chinese companies to dominate in the domestic manufacturing of technology in 10 critical cutting edge areas of technology, things like new materials or clean energy vehicles, AI, these kinds of things. So and they set targets and timetables for achieving that kind of dominance. Dual circulation basically says, which was announced just a few years ago, basically says that China has a large enough economy that it can innovate, manufacture, and consume largely within itself. That's like the one circle of dual circulation, but that it will continue to export, and it still wants the rest of the world and other multinationals to be dependent on China, right, for parts of its supply chain. So it's still important to have them be engaged in China, but China really wanted to insulate itself from the pressures of the global economy while continuing to have the global economy be dependent on China. And then the last dimension where I think Xi Jinping has been transformative or has a transformative vision is in the area of global governance. And if you look back to about 2014, he gave a speech where he said China should not only help to write the rules of the game, but it should help to create the playgrounds on which the games are played, right? And that was about really, taking Chinese norms and values and things like human rights, or even, cyber governance, or it could be technical standards, or China's development initiatives like the Belt and Road, taking those things, pushing them through into other countries, but then cementing them in international institutions like the United Nations. So you could see, for example, that China managed to get the Belt and Road Initiative, which again, Chinese initiative, written into programs or even charters of more than 24 UN agencies and programs, right? So that you had Interpol, for example, so which is not part of the UN, but separate international institution. Interpol say that it would take as part of its mission protecting Belt and Road projects, right? So anyway, a mechanism by which China takes its domestic interests and gets them reinforced in international institutions. So to me, it's a pretty comprehensive and strategic
Interoperable?
no, not interoperable. It should be something like operationalization, which I don't think is the word of its ambitions. I mean, I'm constantly amazed when I look to see, and when China introduces new initiatives like the Global Security Initiative or Global Civilization Initiative or Global Development Initiative, just how it follows this pattern. It's really impressive.
So that's actually what I wanted to follow up on about that. So that's an incredible like landscape of everything that China's attempted and China's vision. But so I guess, but some of these are kind of new ideas that have just sort of been spoken into the world, and others are issues like Belt and Road, where there's been some progress, some significant progress. Like if you had to offer a little sort of scorecard, which of the 5 ambitions has China made the most progress on already?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's made progress on all of them. So the interesting thing about China is they never say never, right? And so when things don't work out the way they want them to work out initially, they pivot. They might rebrand something like Confucius Institutes, right? And call them Mandarin Learning Centers, right? So because Confucius Institute became such a toxic, name, especially in the West. So China had envisioned to have 1,000 Confucius Institutes, part of a soft power initiative, right? Confucius Institute's about teaching Chinese language and sharing Chinese culture. But many American and other Western universities became concerned because oftentimes the contracts were opaque. They required that they use teachers from mainland China and that China determines the curriculum. And that's the kind of agreement that universities typically don't strike, right? And so there were some protests. Anyway, so what happened now, they're supposed to have 1,000 by 2020. They only have 540. So is that a success? Is that a failure? China keeps going. It keeps pushing, right? So even as you see the number of Confucius Institutes contracting in the West, you see them expanding slowly in Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. So, I'll give you one other example that I think is so telling because it's been in the press recently. If you look at China's, emergence, right, as this global power in terms of the manufacture and export of electric vehicles, right? That's something that's, caught a lot of people's attention. It's been in the media. It's as though China burst out of nowhere, right? Somehow magically, China assumed leadership in this space. China's been working on clean energy vehicles since 1999, right? So this is not, there's no magic here. And I can tell you all through this period, there are many points at which, China does what it does, which it pours government money into this, both central government money and local government money. And then it sets these targets in the timetables. And, every 5 years, you could get a report on how well it was doing. And 5 years before China burst onto the scene, they're 500,000 vehicles short. They're producing buses that don't have electric buses that don't have seats. They've got, it's crazy what it looks like. The landscape looks so bad. It's as though it's Soviet era, command and control, producing things that don't function, of poor quality. But they persist. They persist, and eventually they are where they are today with high quality electric vehicles, that can compete globally.
Yeah. So I wanted to just follow up on a couple of these ambitions. So the first one is on global governance, just to sort of make sure I understood exactly what the parameters are here. So is the ambition that China will create new and standing institutions that sort of are competitive to current institutions of global governance, something like the Chinese RCEP trade program or something like the Asia Infrastructure Bank? Or is the ambition to work within existing institutions and move them in a more Chinese-friendly direction, or is it some combination of both?
It's a combination of both. I mean, I think, they'll establish something like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which has been around for a long time, right? That began as sort of a collection of Central Asian, it was Russia, China, committed to anti-terrorism. That's where it began. Then, it's expanded in terms of its sort of writ, so that you'll find now SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization members going to the United Nations on behalf of China's, internet policy, right? Internet governance, which is basically, state control over the internet. And so, so it will take an organization and use it in many different respects. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank was not supposed to be competitive with other development banks. It really was, I think, more an effort by China to demonstrate that it could create an institution that was additive and maintain the same high standards that other development banks like the World Bank held. So I think that was, but it was viewed as competitive, here in the US at the time. There was a lot of concern about it. And in the end, it's, the level of capitalization is so small, it doesn't compete with anything. The real competitors are, China Development Bank, China Exim Bank. And then there's what it's doing in the United Nations, which I think is a reform, an effort to reform within, to bring Chinese values to bear inside the United Nations. And, in some cases, you can think, why does it really matter? It's not that big a deal. But China takes this stuff very seriously. So some cases it really is a big deal. I think in the human rights space, it's a big deal because China has a different conception of human rights than the one that is currently prevails within the UN. Their state-directed nature of the internet is different. They haven't gotten a lot of traction on that yet, but they will persist. Technical standards, one can think it's just competitive, right? They want their technologies to be the standard setting. It's understandable. So we did a request for information at the Commerce Department on this issue because there was a lot of concern in the US government that China was somehow taking over standard setting bodies and going to basically just, push US companies, out, right? And going to dominate along with like Belt and Road, what you would see with Huawei and other Chinese technology companies. So we did this request for information, which basically means you go out and ask companies and associations, relevant companies and associations, to tell you, what do you think about China's behavior in standard setting bodies, right? Within the UN and outside the UN. And what came back was not that China was somehow winning, all the standards, right? What came back was that China was undermining the governance of the standard setting bodies, right? By a couple things. Number one, requiring that, because a lot of standard setting bodies are private sector or private and government sector together. So requiring that everybody coming from China vote as a block, right? So that's not the way they normally work. By having Chinese dominate just in the number of proposals they put forth, even proposals that actually with technologies that weren't even ready. So that was the concern, was that the governance of these bodies was being undermined, not that somehow China was actually dominating, in the actual setting of new standards. So anyway, I tell that story also just because I think it's really important to look very carefully at precisely what it is that China is doing, as opposed to what's in our heads about what China is doing.
Can I just talk about that?
Yeah.
That's meaning, I'm just really curious about that. Like, what's the goal of just creating havoc in standard setting body as and undermining the governance of it, as opposed to trying to influence it in one way?
Well, I think until they're ready to influence it in one way, I think it's like a delay a game tactic, right? So if they can just, if enough Chinese proposals are just put forward, you can imagine that some percentage of them will be accepted,
Okay.
right? Just to get them to stop.
Flood the zone, yeah, okay.
Exactly, flood the zone tactic,
Yeah.
right?
So the other one I wanted to follow up on is Belt and Road, because sometimes I feel that there's three different conversations going on about Belt and Road. There's a conversation that we're having in the United States about this attempt by China to be able to manipulate developing countries and force them into debt traps and expand its influence over the world. And then there's a conversation that's going on in the recipient countries that has to do with their actual infrastructure needs, and then whether the China program is actually meeting their infrastructure needs, and also whether they're best served by the Chinese contractors, state-owned enterprises or private, that are doing it. So that's a completely separate conversation. And then there's a conversation that's taking place in China about whether this is necessarily in China's best interests, whether the acquisition of the Sri Lankan port was a bad deal for certain Chinese banks, and also what is the ultimate purpose of this? Is the purpose of this development and ingratiating themselves, or is the purpose of this ultimately benefiting China's economy? So I'm sort of interested in how you see that in those narratives. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, starting with the last one first, I think in China, it's important to recognize the Belt and Road, like ideas about something like a Belt and Road existed before Xi Jinping came to power, right? And we're kind of floating around. There was a strategic imperative about Belt and Road. There was the economic imperative. So there were discussions about something that was like a Belt and Road, and then Xi Jinping brought it all together. But, in the beginning, the Belt and Road had a lot of projects that had started before the Belt and Road actually came into existence, right? So it's the way I portrayed it when I was talking about it seems like it's very well constructed and one, but that's also not exactly what it was like. There were many elements of it that were much more opportunistic, even haphazard, and just China taking advantage of certain moments, like the Health Silk Road, kind of like just petered along, was not very significant until COVID. COVID hit, and then all of a sudden, the Health Silk Road became something really tangible and important, right, for China. In terms of the way the Chinese talk about it, you're right. There are people in China, there have been for a long time, scholars and others who say, this is a waste of our resources, right? We have a lot of problems at home. We should be focused on those. Why are we doing all of this stuff? There are companies that have said, we don't want to go do these projects. They're money losing for us, right? But we're being directed by the government to go do this. So there has been a lot of debate, but because it's China, those kinds of debates are not allowed in the public sphere. You're not going to see, people's daily, here are the range of views on the Belt and Road, right? So that's not the way it works. But there is a lot of debate within China. And now that China's economy has slowed, of course, they've really pulled back, right? And now the tagline is small and beautiful projects, right? And so that's the way they're going to be pitching it forward. So I think it's the peak of Chinese Belt and Road investment was 2016, I think, and it's gone down since then, and I don't see it ever coming back up. I think in the countries, let's say in the United States, I don't think the narrative is that China's trying to, get these countries, gain leverage on them and get them into this debt trap. That was a Trump administration narrative. That is not the narrative that has been in place during the Biden administration. I think the narrative in the Biden administration is we're concerned about many things having to do with the Belt and Road, in part about the fact that if you think about, the global sort of infrastructure of the past, of the 20th century, that was done by the United States and Japan and others. Look at the technological infrastructure of the 21st century. Is that actually being done by China? What does that mean, right? And are we competitive? So I think there's a real element of competition in the U.S. mindset, not really a belief that China's deliberately trying to go in there and make these countries dependent. And in the countries, I think the other narrative I would add to the ones that you suggest is there have been a lot of protests in Belt and Road countries. I think in virtually every Belt and Road country, there have been protests around the way that China has done business, certain companies have done business, the lack of transparency in the contracts, the environmental standards, labor, not using local labor, right?
Thousands of Chinese workers.
Exactly, exactly. So actually not benefiting the local economy. So I think, yes, there are narratives about we need this investment and China's the only one who's bringing it. So don't complain about it, United States and others, right? If we're perfectly happy to entertain investment from you, just show us the money,
Right.
right? But that doesn't mean that they're happy necessarily with all the projects. And, there are also the complaints that the work is not, A plus. Buildings are shoddy, trucks don't work. So there's all of that as well.
Right. Yeah. And yeah, I've heard all sorts of like horror stories about train tracks not being of the same gauge in different parts of the country and things like that. Yeah. So I want to riff off of, or sort of spin off of one point that you made, which is the conversation in China and the sort of opportunities for debate. And I'll come back to, you wrote this excellent chapter in Evan Medeiros' book, Cold Rivals, The Evolution of America's China Policy.
Mm-hmm.
And rethink, reset, recalibrate. But there was one piece on that, which was the Xi factor. And that, this subsection where you talked about the influence of one man and the concentration of power. And so I think that's really important for understanding these debates and how these debates end up manifesting in terms of policy. Like, how influential is Xi Jinping right now? How important it is this single decision maker? And how do we think about that when we're thinking about foreign policy?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is another area of some debate, right, in the U.S. I think both actually in academic circles and also in policy circles is what we've seen over the past decade in China, is it inevitable? Is just the way that, China was bound to go because it's a Marxist-Leninist state and it's the natural thing, or is this just, or it's a Thucydides trap in China's rise and, there couldn't be anything other than what we see today. So I am of a mind that actually Xi Jinping matters a lot. And so I think if you look back to 2010 and 2011 in China, look at the domestic political situation in China is radically different from the domestic political situation you have now. And, the internet was a very vibrant space for political debate. You had, calls for a lot. You had over 180,000 protests on the streets in 2010. You had people calling for environmental reform and political reform. You had candidates running on independent election, as independents in elections, local elections. I mean, it was a very, very different China, very active engagement from the outside world, 7,000, international non-governmental organizations working inside China in partnership with Chinese civil society. Now there are fewer than 400, right? You had liberal oriented newspapers publishing those kinds of debates, with scholars talking about the need for political reform. It was a different political landscape. So from my perspective, and everything changed, 2012 to 2013. It was a steady march of a greater concentration of power into Xi Jinping's political hands, increased political repression at home, increased intrusion of the party into the economy, into Chinese people's lives. The gradual we've seen, the gradual, even with the private economy in China now, that the party is playing a much more aggressive role inside private companies, ensuring that private companies are aligned with, party objectives. Much greater control over the internet, much greater control over information from the outside world. Most recently, huge crackdown on data, inside China that is allowed out, right? So to me, it's a 180 degrees, from what was to what is today. So I personally don't understand when people say they think Xi Jinping is no different really from a Jiang Zemin or a Hu Jintao or, previous Chinese leaders. I see him as radical, transformative leader.
So I want to probe this a little bit, like both on sort of the history, a little bit of how we got here, what it was about Xi Jinping, but also like the future prospects for this type of concentration of power. So in sort of thinking about the history of it, like there's a lot of debates about how it was that he was able to consolidate power. Was it the use of the anti-corruption campaign? Was it his role as sort of an alignment with other princelings? Was it his ability to use sort of party institutions that were on the books, but that had never really been exploited like that before, like small leading groups? Like what were the tools?
I think you just answered all the questions right there.
Oh, okay, those are all three. I
think it was an excellent. I mean, he did all of those things. I mean, the anti-corruption campaign was real. for sure. And it was probably the one thing, if you look at Xi Jinping's rise up the political system, it's one thing that he talked about all along the way, was, that he didn't think that officials should be able to use their positions for personal economic gain. And so I think he really does and did want to rat out corruption, but it's also clear that he targeted, especially early on, those officials who were tied, especially at senior levels, tied to political groups, factions that were stood in opposition to Xi Jinping. Right. So there was a really good study that was done by professor at Harvard, demonstrated again early on at the vice level of vice minister and above, about 40% of those people who were detained for corruption were considered to be, opposed to Xi. So we know that that's the case, that he used that. The small leading groups also, right? Small leading groups are those, they sit above the ministries and commissions, and they basically oversee broad swaths of policy, both domestic and foreign. So it was, could be on cyber. There's one on Taiwan. There's a leading group on, economic reform and development. And usually the leadership of these would be shared among members of the Standing Committee of the Politburo. But at least by 5 years ago or so, Xi Jinping was on top of at least half of them. He was in charge of at least half of them. So he used that control for sure to push his own policies. But I think, what enabled him to do what he did and to do it so quickly, in part, I think, is that before he came to power, there was a sense that the party had lost its moral center, that it had no gravitational pull, that the party members really were using the party as a means for personal, political, and economic advancement, that it was kind of rotten, at its core. And you were facing all these protests. Had local officials who were afraid, to respond to these protests and basically just folded. And so I think, Xi Jinping said about the corruption issue, if corruption is not addressed, it could mean the death not only of the Chinese Communist Party, but the death of the Chinese state. So I think it was at that level of concern that he moved in and began immediately to say, this needs to be done. Hard to argue against it. I think the other thing he did was he came in and he was bold, right? He had a vision. He started off talking about the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. He gave life to the idea of bringing Chinese centrality, back, right? China was a great empire. He also linked, and this was new, right? He linked sort of contemporary China back to ancient China and all the way through, right? Tried to make a connective line that didn't break, in 1949, right? And so I think there was a lot about him. He's strong, right? And I mean, look, our own country, right? We see sometimes people feel the need or have a desire for someone they believe to be a strong leader who comes in and says, this is what we're going to do. This is,
Institutions be damned. We're gonna, get this.
Exactly. There's a lot of similarities there, actually.
So the counterfactual, if Bao Xilai's wife had not been implicated in a murder and Bao Xilai was still in the Politburo, would this have been? I
don't know that Bao Xilai is the right person to look at. I'm more interested in thinking about people like Li Yuanchao or even Li Keqiang, people who had strong reform credentials.
Yeah.
And what might have been different had they actually been in charge. That's the game I like to play. And I think we could have had a pretty different job.
A different environment.
Yeah.
So the future-looking question is, so what are the prospects of this consolidation continuing? Like, should future foreign policymakers dealing with China be thinking that we're going to be dealing with the consolidated environment rather than the more institutionalized environment that we encountered with Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao?
I don't, honestly, I don't know. I think, one thing about states, like authoritarian states, it's hard, and one that is so opaque, it's really hard to know, like all the sources of dissent and discontent. I think we could be surprised one day. I think one of the things that I've started thinking a lot about and in terms of Chinese domestic politics is how polarized Chinese society is today, for example, right? Polarized along gender lines, along ethnic lines. Income inequality is as great as it is in the United States. You've got 600 odd million people living on $150 a month or less, with very little opportunity to advance into sort of the economy of the 21st century, because the educational system doesn't allow for it. And a divide, I think, also among what you would consider to be the creative class and the bureaucratic class, right? People whose job it is to think like outside the box, right? Whether you're an entrepreneur or you're an intellectual, your opportunities over the past decade have become so much more constrained, so small. So I think, there's that element of it. I think there are international headwinds, the decision to support Russia. I did some research recently where I read a lot of scholars, Chinese scholars' writings on Russia, right? The fact China supported Russia, and they've actually done some popular opinion polling. A lot of unhappiness with China's support for Russia domestically. And there's a great poll that basically said like 97% of Chinese support, Russia. 97% of Chinese young people want to go study in Russia. Their number one place they want to go study, et cetera. And then there's a Chinese scholar who took this poll and wrote about it and said, none of these things is true, actually. And so that should lead you to doubt the overall assessment that these people support the Russian support.
That is a bold scholar.
So yeah, but he did it in a very, very subtle way.
Okay.
So anyhow, my only point being, I think there's a lot of debate and dissent, and is it off the table that at some point you couldn't have the top group in the Chinese government say, not Xi Jinping, you're out, but you need to take a step back because you've actually taken us down a road. Look at the Chinese economy, et cetera, that where we are not prospering either economically or politically. So this is what happened to Mao Zedong after the Great Leap Forward. Take a step back to the second line, and you end up with a much more collective leadership again. I'm not predicting that.
Right, or something like bubbling up dissent, like we saw during COVID with the white paper movement. That might lead to other leaders to think that they need to constrain.
Yeah, it would need to be much bigger than that. But yes, something like that. So I think, I'd say never say never. Okay.
All right, so I want to pivot a little bit to U.S.-China policy. So as I said, you wrote this excellent chapter, and I want to dig deeper into it, but I first want to sort of have you sketch sort of the major sort of themes and pivot points in U.S.-China policy, sort of from Biden to Obama, and also
Obama to Biden.
Obama to Biden. Yeah, and also of sort of finding the right balance between competition and cooperation.
So I think if you look the overall history of the U.S.-China relationship since normalization in the late 1970s, right? We had this policy of engagement, right, which basically meant that we were looking to work with China to bring it into the current system of international organizations, regimes, and values, which are basically Western dominated. And then at the same time, there was a belief inherent in engagement that as China's economy grew, that it would begin to transform into a market democracy, right? So those were the two sort of elements of our engagement approach. Didn't mean that there weren't areas of challenge. There were, especially three that dominated for like really 3 decades, and they were Taiwan, trade, and human rights. So those were really the 3 issues that were the sticking points between the United States and China for most of the history of the relationship. I think in beginning with the financial crisis, the global financial crisis, you started to have a little bit of a sense in China among some in the elite that maybe the U.S. model is not all it's cracked up to be, and some questioning about the United States, and some thoughts about China as a rising power and what China's role on the global stage might be. And then moving ahead a little bit more, you had a sort of more assertive policy emanating in the South China Sea, right? And then you had the very famous statement by Yang Jiechi, who was formerly China's foreign minister, we are a big country, you are small countries, to, Singapore, and this sense that China was starting to flex its muscles a little bit. And I think at that moment, that's when you began to have that was really the first pivot, which was really the Obama pivot to Asia. So a sense that while we'd always had this sort of engage but hedge strategy, now we're moving a little bit into a hedge but engage, right? And the pivot was really about putting a priority on our partners and allies in the Asia Pacific, sort of saying we have ignored this region to our detriment, right? It's fastest growing region. We need to be there economically. We need to be more engaged economically. That's when you started to have negotiations for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We need to be there militarily. We're going to move 60% of our, Navy to the well, this wasn't the Indo-Pacific yet, to the Asia Pacific. So there was this reorientation to Asia on the grounds that, Asia was the most vibrant part of the world, but also in the back of our minds because of China and the rise of China's power in the region. So that was the first, I think, significant shift. Then you had the Trump era, which really was radical shift. And the way I talk about it in the chapter is almost two different kinds of policies, right? One being driven by President Trump, which was very idiosyncratic, personalistic, whatever. Xi Jinping is my best friend. To which I always point out that Xi Jinping says Putin is his best friend. He doesn't say that Trump is his best friend. So, exactly, just like that. So, and Kim Jong-un, and so this kind of a love affair with, dictators, but then, and this very transactional thing. So if China helps us with North Korea, then we'll give them a better trade deal, or, if they help us with North Korea, then we don't care about Taiwan, or just this kind of, every which way you don't know. There is no strategic intent. There's no operational strategy that one can discern. And then, of course, withdrawing very anti sort of traditional U.S. foreign policy in terms of, talking about like a lack of importance of our allies and partners, right? Threatening to withdraw from NATO, pulling us out of the Paris Climate Accord and the, Iran nuclear deal and the World Health Organization, et cetera. So much less of a focus on the traditional role of the United States as a leader of the current international liberal order.
And just the 2018 tariffs.
Okay, and then which came about because we didn't get the trade deal that we wanted to get. So a big, and that had a lot to do with USTR Lighthizer, who had that in his head for a very long time, that somehow we had been cheated and fooled and made to look stupid for decades in terms of our trade relationship with China, and this was the time to rectify that. But at the same time as you had all of that happening, you actually had a second layer of Trump policy that came from Secretary Mattis and H.R. McMaster, Matt Pottinger, who was at the NSC, which was much more traditionalist in its orientation. So it retained a focus on our allies and partners in Asia, for example, and you saw the strengthening of the Quad with India and Japan and Australia. Europeans didn't fare so well, but in Asia, actually, there really was overall, I would say, a bolstering of the U.S. presence in the region and engagement with partners there. You had the United States still pushing back against China in the United Nations. You had, going out and trying to push back against the Belt and Road Initiative, right? So trying to rally some U.S. companies or actually we didn't have any companies, but to sort of provide alternatives to Huawei, our clean networks, right? So we needed to make sure that the subsea cables and 5G and satellite systems, all those things are not controlled by China. So there was a lot of thinking and a much more proactive approach by a kind of second tier of officials who, I don't know whether they were doing this and the president didn't realize it, or I don't know exactly how it all happened. But I think it's important to recognize that there was a lot of energy being put out in a very different way, in a very different space. But still a much more contentious, confrontational relationship. And then finally, you move to the Biden administration, and the policy here is managed competition, right? That's the tagline for it. What does that mean? Basically, for the first 2.5 years of the Biden administration, the effort was about trying to make the United States able to compete with China in the 21st century. And this had sort of 3 pillars to it. First was the invest, and Tony Blinken laid this out in his speech quite well. First was invest, so that's like the Chips and Science Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. These are all things that basically speak to the U.S. need to build back up our R&D, our advanced manufacturing, and our basic infrastructure, right? So broadband for everyone, right? Tech hubs, putting them in places that aren't Silicon Valley and Silicon Alley. So, bringing together community colleges and local organizations and, industry and local government to focus on things like clean tech, right? Using government capital to leverage private capital. That's what Chips and Science, for example, is all about. So that's one big pillar of the Biden administration strategy. Another is the compete part, and this is interpreted differently. I can say from the Commerce Department, the way we interpret it is by modernizing our economic tools, which means taking things like export controls, the inbound investment screening, CFIUS process, starting with outbound investment now screening, and also supply chain diversification, right? Which is a totally new endeavor that began because of COVID. So all of these things, making them, tightening them, enhancing them so that we can protect our national economic security. And then finally, the third pillar is about aligning with our allies and partners. And again, this is, vastly different from what came before. There's a lot of repair work to be done, certainly with the Europeans. But establishing new institutions like the US-EU Trade and Technology Council, or AUKUS with the Australia and the UK and the United States, which is about sharing of technology and nuclear submarines partnership. There's more work that's been done on the Quad, and then there's the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, right, which was our effort to have an economic engagement in the Indo-Pacific in the absence of actually having any kind of real trade agreement. So all of these things are about working with our allies and partners, and then a much more proactive effort also within the United Nations, getting back in action there. So, so that's the competition, and then there's the managed part, right? And the managed part is about the bilateral relationship with China. And that really, I would say, was pretty fractious up until the summer, last summer. And that's when you saw a number of cabinet secretaries, including Secretary Raimondo, go to China and begin to have sort of bilateral engagements with their counterparts, with their Chinese counterparts. And I think, they've set in motion, certainly, I mean, Secretary Kerry had long continued to have discussions around climate change, but set in motion in Treasury and Commerce both, and also now DOD, bilateral discussions, right? Just an effort to prevent the relationship from devolving, to a point where you're really at risk of kinetic conflict. So I think it's a really important, part of the strategy that, and culminated in the Woodside Summit between President Xi and Biden on the sidelines of APEC in November, where you saw new agreements, right, around fentanyl. That's when you got the mill-to-mill dialogue restarted, more on climate change. So those, I think, considered to be pretty positive.
Can since you got a chance to be involved in this a lot, and it is an important pillar of the Biden administration's policy in Asia. What are the main goals and the main goals and tools available through the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework?
So the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is not technically part of our China strategy. It really is about engaging the countries in the Indo-Pacific in a way that will enhance trade and investment, again, without actually having a trade agreement. And so there are 4 pillars to it. There's the clean economy, there's the fair economy, there is the supply chain, and then there's digital. And so the Commerce Department was responsible for three, everything but the digital. That was USTR. And I know Ambassador Tai was here before, so maybe you heard about that pillar when she was here. That pillar was the one that wasn't concluded. The other three pillars were concluded, the Commerce Department pillars. And they're really about setting norms and standards that will support high-level trade and investment. And I think early on, there was concern, I think, in the administration. So Secretary of Commerce, was basically given this to do, right, and to create with not any real guidance about what it should look like. And Secretary Raimondo hired a fantastic person to negotiate it, Sharon Yuen. She did an amazing job. She'd been in government before at Treasury and just superb negotiator. But there really wasn't a sense for what this thing might look like because nobody had done anything like it before. And so early on, Secretary said, we need something to give to these countries because we're not giving them market access, which is what everybody wants, right? And so what can we do to get them excited about this? And so when we launched it with this digital upskilling initiative, which was basically getting 14 US companies to come in and provide 500,000 digital skilling opportunities to women and girls in the emerging economies of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. So that's the first thing that we did just to start to get them energized and excited. And, I could tell you the trade minister from Fiji was at the launch in Los Angeles, and he was like, this is the best thing ever, because he got Microsoft and Apple and two other companies to go to Fiji, right, to do this digital skilling in a country of 3 million people, right? You never have had these companies there to do that. And so I think that was the beginning. And I think from that point on, the importance of public-private partnership in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, that is the central element of it. And so everything that's going to happen in IPEF is going to happen because of that public-private partnership. And so there was just on the supply chain and clean economy pillars, there was just a big investment forum that happened in Washington that brought together private equity firms, some banks, some other tech companies, and talking about different stages of investment that would be needed in the IPEF economies around the clean economy and supply chain stuff, and how they were going to do that, and setting up a new fund to invest to do this. So now is the time when you've got to give life to all of this, and I think there's enormous positive energy around it. So we'll see what happens, but I think it's on the right track. I would say, President Trump has said that if he's reelected, he's going to get rid of it. I think the way that we should be thinking about both this and things like the US-EU TTC is that as much as possible, we need to embed the efforts in the private sector.
Right.
And so,
right, self-automating reinforcement.
Exactly. So it doesn't have to rely on government intervention.
Yeah. So I do want to follow up on that, but we might have to save that for later because because I know that I want to open it up to the audience. But before I do, I just want to ask. So I'm just going to jump to the big question on my sheet. The one, those
weren't big.
Well, this is the scary one. Are we? There's a question, a big one out there about whether the U.S. and China have entered a new Cold War, right? And there's so Richard Betts has been making these arguments in the book that you were involved in, but then there's another argument that simply that this is impossible given the interdependence of these two economies, and that the level of disentangling that would be necessary to have a new Cold War is not really possible. Where do you stand on this sort of existential debate?
I mean, I think I don't want to say we're on the precipice of a new Cold War, but I mean, there are definitely elements of a new Cold War in the relationship. I think there is a zero-sum element to it. When China talks about, the East is rising, the West is declining, or it's the triumph of socialism over capitalism, it's hard not to see it a little bit like that, right? That there is a strong, ideological component that you also had in the era of the Soviet and U.S. Cold War. Are there blocks emerging? that one is a little more tricky
Mhm.
because obviously we have NATO and the G7 and institutions that are rooted in democracies, right? And China has the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but the G20 is a mix, right? And the BRICS expansion is a mix. And so I think more countries are playing important roles in ways that won't lend themselves to be divided into two in the way, again, that you had the blocs in the Cold War. And in terms of the economic, but I do think that it's important. And when you see China working closely with Iran and Russia, there is cause for concern there, I think. And then in terms of the economic disentanglement element of it, I guess I don't see that as a barrier really to a new Cold War, I have to say, in part because you can continue to have trade and investment. And also because if you look at what's happening right now in terms of like negative outflow of FDI, right, from China, but also real efforts on the part of US companies, many of them to move significant parts of their supply chains out.
Right, the friendshoring.
Friendshoring, reshoring. I think there's a really different, from the time that I started at Commerce to today, the mindset of American companies, and not just because of China, but because of Russia, Ukraine, because of potentially China, Taiwan, because of the push from the US government, because of things like export controls, because of what China is doing inside China with regard to things like, the national security law and the raids on companies. There's much greater concern, not only about the security of companies' data, but also the personal security of the people who are working there. I think all of these things are having a chilling effect on the economic relationship in ways that, again, push us towards separation as opposed to coming together.
So there's these other analysts out there, and I sort of wanted to sort of lay out the spectrum of analysts that out there. So there's the Michael Pillsbury view that we've been in this Cold War for a long time. We just started learning it, and we're entering the marathon late in the race. That this has been going on, and there's been a sort of a grand plan in China that we're only now catching up with. And that's sort of one spectrum of this, that the U.S. is now only learning that we were in this battle. And then on the other side of the spectrum is someone like Jessica Weiss, who I respect very much, who she's a good friend who's been making the argument that we're not in it yet, but our actions might be self-perpetuating in the sense that we do more of this, we push this envelope a little bit more, and we might just end up there. Yep. And that there's still time to find opportunities for cooperation that might keep us from something. Where do you think where's truth in between these two big extremes?
Right here. No, I mean, I think, look, Michael's argument also rests very heavily on security, writings by and interviews with military and security people and analysts. And I think, one thing about any of this research, and whenever you're doing research at all, is, I mean, if you're going to select a group and interview that group, there's a little bit of an element of selection bias there. And you can also, just as you could in the United States, find the full array of perspectives when you read through Chinese scholars' writings or talk to Chinese officials. And so you can choose to stress one thing or another, and also officials can choose to pick up on one set of ideas or another set of ideas. So personally, I don't believe that, again, this is one long, sort of through line that was inevitably going to lead us to this point. I think leaders make choices, and the choices, right, that Xi Jinping has made look more like the ones that Michael, talks about. But again, I don't think it was inevitable. As far as Jessica's arguments are concerned, look, I think I'm sympathetic to Jessica's idea that, we need to understand China's insecurity and that actions we take make them more insecure. But I think there's a little bit of too much of an emphasis on somehow the U.S. is responsible for what's happening and not enough of China plays a huge role in what's going on. And, I can look at someone like Wang Jisoo, who's one of the sort of, most important, has been in the past one of the most important scholars of U.S.-China relations in China. And, wrote a great, or was interviewed, I think it was the FT, where he said, if you want to understand why U.S. policy has changed, it's because China's policy has changed. And so I think that we have to appreciate the degree to which, we had this long-standing policy of engagement. We didn't really budge from it, right, for 30 years. And it was only when we started to see changes in China's policy that we started to react. And people will argue that we were slow off the mark, right? We spent decades saying that we'll put up with, IP theft and subsidies, et cetera, because at a certain point in time, China is going to be a pillar of the international order and is going to be responsible in all these areas. Right. And that's what led to people like Donald Trump saying, we're suckers, right? Because we let that go on for so long. So I think, to me, Jessica misses the boat by not holding China responsible enough for the situation that we're in.
That's great. That's a great answer. So with that, why don't we have about 15 minutes, so why don't we open it up to the audience? Do we have a mic out in the audience, or should I surrender mine? Or, yeah, so why don't, are there any?
I can pass you around.
Yeah, okay, go ahead.
Hi, I found this fascinating. You covered a lot of different topics. My name is Kaylee Glenn. I'm a postdoc with the American Grand Strategy Program. And I wanted to ask you about U.S. foreign policy towards China. It seems to be prioritizing a range of economic tools, as you mentioned, export controls, tariffs. And I was curious, what do you see as the potential effects of these tools on Chinese government behavior? Can we expect a similar effect as the export controls and sanctions that were imposed in response to the Tiananmen Square massacre? You also mentioned that in combination with these export controls, we've got high-level talks that are going on with Secretary of Commerce and that's similar to what we saw as George Bush's strategy, or George Bush the first strategy in the 80s as well. Or are we in a different era? Is this strategy of engage and hedge, now hedge and engage, going to affect Chinese government behavior to the use of these controls? So sort of, I know that was a lot, but what do you see as the effect of these tools on Chinese government behavior today?
Yeah, so I think it's a good question. I would separate out the Tiananmen period. I think it's different, and it was, Tiananmen massacre caused a huge breach in the relationship that I think is different from what's happening today. So, but in terms of the economic tools and how we use them and how China's reacting, I think it is a central concern for them and a central interest for them, I can tell you. My feeling is that we need to do a better job of being clear about what each one of these tools is designed to do, right, and why it's being used. And by that, I mean, we have tools like export controls that are explicitly for technologies that we believe are related to our national security, right, or our democratic values, right? They are not about competitiveness issues, right? Tariffs are tied to competitiveness issues, right? So tariffs could be we do a 301, it could be for intellectual property rights, that we could do it for subsidies, whatever. We do investigations and determine that China is doing things that, are anti-market, right? And we're going to take action. Tariff is a response to that. So I think we need to make clear, sometimes the language is not clear and we say things like, we're slowing them down, right, with our export controls. That is not the point of the export control. I think that gives a muddled message and leads to confusion in China. It's not helpful. In terms of a Chinese response, we've seen China now come back and undertake its own, right, export controls. And so I think we can expect more of that. To date, I would say they haven't been enormously consequential for the U.S., but the potential certainly exists, right, especially around things like rare earths and other kind of critical minerals where China commands the processing, at levels of, 90%. So I think that is a source of concern. I think the dialogue that we're having, though, is important, and has the potential, and there are little strands to the dialogue. There are offshoots of specialized topics that are being discussed. I'm hopeful it can bring some stability to the relationship. There's also, one of the dialogues is an information exchange on export controls. And I think that's really important. And that's a mechanism by which we explain our export control policy, and just simple things have helped. For example, pre-notification. When we're going to take an action, letting the Chinese know. When the Chinese are going to take an action, they'll let us know in advance, right? We've also moved companies, off the unverified list, right? The Chinese are appreciative of that, right? That helps them as well. So I think there are small steps we can take that are sort of trust building in some respects. But again, I think it hinges on being very clear about what it is you're doing and why. Having said that, I'll just say quickly, the Chinese owe us that as well, because what's going on in terms of the intersection of national security and economic competitiveness in China is beyond the pale and very difficult to understand, when you have military civil fusion, where those boundaries are.
So yeah, thank you for your fascinating talk. So I'm Phương. I'm a third-year PhD student in political science here, and I just want to follow up on the point that Kaylee just raised. So beyond economic tools, you mentioned about the diversification of supply chains. So I just wonder how such diversification affects the activities of American firms abroad, especially in terms of their supply chain abroad.
As you know, they're all going to Vietnam, so it's good for Vietnam's economy, actually. But so I think I can say a little bit about the kind of work that's underway in the U.S. government. For example, there's an effort to map supply chains, right, around things like semiconductors or APIs, or, I think there are 10 areas that we're working on right now to understand where U.S. vulnerabilities are. And it's really complicated and challenging work. And we have a pretty big team at the Department of Commerce that is doing this. In terms of how it's affecting firms, I think, again, to go back to the point I made, I think a number of factors are influencing firms' decisions to reorient their supply chains. Some of it has to do with what happened with Russia and Ukraine and the shock they took to the system then. Some of it has to do with COVID, what they experienced, with the supply chains there. And again, the concerns over China, Taiwan, and what might happen if they're, over-dependent either on Taiwan or mainland China. And some of it has to do with U.S. policy, U.S. encouragement of supply chain diversification, to the point that I can say we have CEOs coming to the Commerce Department and asking for assistance on mapping supply chains, on helping them think through how they can diversify, and I'm talking big U.S. companies, how they can diversify their supply chains. I know one company where the CEO said, a very big company, CEO said to his people that he wanted them to find replacements for all the first tier components that they source from China, 2,500, right, by 2025. Right, that's very aggressive. So I think there's a desire to make sure that companies are not overly reliant on China, or frankly, overly reliant on any one source at this point. I mean, because, when it comes to semiconductors, the over-reliance is not on mainland China, it's on Taiwan. So I think there are a number of factors that are driving it. The U.S. government, of course, is encouraging it. And yeah, so I think it's really a sea change right now.
Thank you so much for your talk. I'm Lauren. I am an undergrad, and my question is about Southeast Asia. So you mentioned there's been a big battlefield with regard to the Cold War, and one of them being Southeast Asia. I think the U.S. has very strong democratic allies in the Northeast with Japan and Taiwan, but with Southeast Asia, it has very long history of autocratic regimes, which are kind of misaligned with the U.S. democratic reforms. And so I think my question is, how do you see this arena playing out in the future, especially with supply chains in Vietnam? You have countries like Singapore and Vietnam very open to China. Open to China and the US. No, sorry, what am I saying? Singapore and Vietnam open to the US, but countries like Laos and Cambodia a lot more economically dependent on China. So how do you see that playing out in the region? Thank you.
Yeah, it's such a, I think actually I should take this question, so I'm going to hand the mic to him in a second, but I will say, I was just looking at some public opinion polling in Southeast Asia, and it's so interesting. There's one question that was asked, if forced to choose, like, whom would you choose, right? Because they're always countries in Southeast Asia, you know better than I do. We don't want to choose. We don't want to choose, blah, blah, blah. And so, yeah,
Don't make us choose.
exactly. Don't make us choose. And interestingly, Indonesia, Brunei, and one other, and I can't remember what it is, chose China, and all the rest chose the United States, including Cambodia, right? So I think there's a kind of odd, and the polls are all over the place, right, on the different kinds of questions that are asked. I think there's clear concern about China as a security threat in the region. There's a dependence on China, but the dependence doesn't necessarily breed affinity, right? So I think but I'm going to defer to you in about 2 seconds. I think, in countries like Cambodia, while you see they reflect like low levels of trust that China will do the right thing, right? I think that's not the way that the elite in China and in Cambodia behave, but at the elite, like interviewees, not officials, and then in the broader population, I think there's a lot of concern about too much Chinese influence. So I think it's a very mixed bag without a lot of clarity about like the cross cuts, on economic issues and security issues and the value issues. Vietnam, becoming a close security partner with the United States, right? Huge, offloading place for the supply chain, effort right now. But obviously is not a democracy. So I think there are just many different issues that play out there, but there's some really interesting polling that I would encourage you to look at. But I don't want you to say where this is your
my neck of the woods. Yeah. So it's a really complicated question. I think you knew that when you asked it, and the way you framed it was really interesting because you started by saying there's a lot of non-democratic regimes, and I think we're all watching Indonesia really carefully to see what might happen there with Prabowo's election. But that's a really important way to think about it because I think there is a big gap between what citizens may feel towards China, and many of these countries have long, sometimes competitive histories with China. That's definitely the Vietnamese case, and citizens have strong feelings about China versus what elites are doing in China. And you're absolutely correct to say that elites in Cambodia and Laos have to some extent made decisions that have locked them into very close economic relations with China. Vietnam is really interesting for a number of reasons because Vietnam follows something called bamboo diplomacy, right? So bend but not break, and Vietnam's goal is to constantly triangulate between different groups. So it signed its comprehensive strategic partnership with the United States and then immediately followed that up with a visit from Xi Jinping and an announcement of closer relations there. So I do think, I do think that there is a real question in Southeast Asia among a lot of groups about about the elites anyway, about being forced to choose between this because many of them are economically dependent on China and to some extent growing in their economic dependence on the United States. So just on Vietnam, it's a really interesting issue, really interesting in that China is Vietnam's largest source of imports and the US is Vietnam's largest source of exports, just to give you a sense of the tension that Vietnam faces in this policy. Okay, so we've hit 6:45, and I know that some of you want to talk to, we have one more burning question here. Before everybody runs out of the room, let me make a couple of announcements about what's coming. So we do have a couple of big talks that with AGS that you all should put on your calendars. Can the Constitution bring Americans together? a conversation with EGAN visiting professor Yuval Levin that will take place here in Stanford. And then a really interesting one on Tuesday, March 26th on NATO at 75, a conversation with Kay Bailey Hutchinson and Ambassador Douglas Salute. And that will take place in Fleischman Commons. We'll take that. Why don't we take that one more burning question, and then I want to make sure that we give Elizabeth.
Sure, thanks. Hi, I'm Jonathan Weiner, a professor here and also University Fellow at Resources for the Future in DC. And so my question is about environmental issues and climate change, which you mentioned at least briefly in the talk. And I know some of your first couple of books were on environmental issues internationally and in China. So I'm curious what you think of the prospects today, both for climate change as a topic of U.S.-China cooperation, but also of the prospects for U.S.-China cooperation in shaping global environmental issues.
Okay, so on the first, I'm a little bit worried that now that Xie Zhenhua is retiring and Secretary Kerry is moving on, that that personal relationship, which I think really drove a lot of the work and effort around the cooperation, it might be difficult to replicate that same level of intensity and enthusiasm, even though it didn't actually produce a huge amount of positive outcome. They kept trying and kept working. There's still some good work that's going on at the subnational level with California and China, but overall, I'm a little bit concerned that energy and momentum might fall a little bit by the wayside. In terms of whether they can play a role, their cooperation can play an important role in sort of, again, jump-starting somehow, more work on climate change, right? That's your question, kind of the cooperation element of it. I'd like to say yes, and I think that's it's easy. I could just say yes. Yes, I do think that. I think probably more likely the best we can hope for is that, each side will agree to do some good things independently as opposed to a real cooperative, back and forth that parallel tracks, right? Methane agreement, benchmarking our progress, this kind of thing. Maybe I'm wrong, but I definitely don't see it as a panacea for the relationship writ large, and I'm not 100% confident that it's going to drive much moving forward. Sorry.
Well, this has been just a wonderful conversation. I hope you learned as much as I did. I learned a ton. Thank you, Professor Economy, Dr. Economy, for sharing all your views with us. And for the students that are attending the dinner, you'll get a chance to ask some more questions later. But right now, just a hearty thank you for congratulations. You survived your talk.